Friedman is really the father of modern American cryptology.
This is somebody who had a direct effect on the winning and losing of war.
Friedman's role in breaking the Japanese Purple Code is one of the great secrets of the 20th century.
There's almost no area of modern life that isn't somehow touched on by the developments that Friedman is involved in.
It was something about his brain that allowed him to look at code and see plain text.
This is somebody who created a vocabulary, who stabilized a science, who invented new ways to approach the way in which secret meanings work.
He was a man who believed in precision and doing things right and doing the right thing.
He lays the foundation for everything that has been achieved to date and needs to be remembered for that.
William Friedman was born in Russia in the late 1880s. His parents immigrated to the United States because of the pogroms in Russia. They were Jewish. And they came and settled in Pittsburgh. And that's where he grew up with his brothers and sisters, and then eventually went to college at Cornell and then went on to his career, first as a geneticist and then later as a cryptographer.
He then didn't set out, of course, to go into code breaking or code making, although it was a different kind of code that he was interested in, because he became a student in college and then as a graduate student in biology and in plant genetics. And he was hired by George Fabian to come to Riverbank Laboratories to work on crop propagation. And as far as I understand, he was hired as the head of a department of genetics at Riverbank Laboratories, which consisted of one person, William Friedman.
Friedman came to study wheat, and I think one of the things he did was planting wheat at different times of the day and night and different phases of the moon, because Fabian thought maybe that would encourage wheat to grow.
Riverbank was on a river bank, as the name suggests, the Fox River in Geneva, Illinois, and it was a rural retreat. It was very much like what we would call in the Renaissance a villa. It's an agricultural and recreational complex with a serious, almost college structure attached to it, with departments and deans and what the letterhead called a standing faculty.
It was a lovely place, but it was run rather like a plantation. You lived in a big house, or in the case of William Friedman, he lived in a windmill. And they met for, meals, and there was a place to swim, and you could take long walks in the woods. They would leave little pitchers of ice water by the bed at night and fresh flowers in the room, but you were paid a pittance.
Fabian was eccentric, I think, to say the least.
George Fabian was a very wealthy man who had deep and quirky interests in advancement of learning, in secrets, science, broadly speaking, and in publicity. And he invested in what he thought were the most interesting kind of cutting-edge subjects that were out there, and created what we would probably now call a private think tank around a couple of areas. One area was acoustics research, and the acoustics company, Riverbank Laboratories, was extremely successful and actually still trades to this day on the Riverbank site. The other area was ciphers, and specifically the Shakespeare authorship controversy. And he hired and supplied an entire team, technical support team, for someone named Elizabeth Wells Gallup, who was extremely compelling in her arguments for there being cryptic evidence or cryptographic evidence that Francis Bacon had written Shakespeare's plays, And I think Fabian caught a couple of interesting whiffs there. One, he caught publicity, he caught the idea that it may make a big splash, and his name would be attached to that as the patron of this great discovery which had changed our knowledge of the most famous author in history. And I think he also saw a deep interest that really drew everybody at the Riverbank site together. However crazy in a way, and especially in retrospect, the work looks, there was a deep interest in how communication works, in how technology works, in how you could transform one thing into another. These are the deepest questions, I think, in some ways, that science has to pose.
Friedman was not hired at Riverbank to work in cryptology, and there are two lines of thought as to exactly how he came into it, that he naturally got interested in it from exposure to it at his fellow employees. But the story we tend to believe most is that he met Elizabeth Smith, who was one of the young women working on the project, and fell in love with her, and then fell in love with her work.
There's this beautiful document that's in Elizabeth's papers that describes the first day they worked together and how Billy, she called him, was watching her as she was working. And a paper flutters over, she says, and she read it, and it said, "You are the most beautiful woman in the world," or something like that. And in the diary, there's still that torn little sheet of paper with his writing that says, how beautiful you are. And that just gives you this sense of the environment that drew them together.
If you look at the pictures of Elizabeth and William Friedman when they are at Riverbank, you come up with an image of the halcyon days of yore, people tripping through fields of waving grain or flowers, holding hands, wearing clothing that goes from their neck down to their ankles, high-button shoes, spats, summer frocks. We only have, of course, their description of what it was like, but it seems all terribly romantic. It was before the war. People were seemingly more naive in those days. They met, their eyes locked. They fell in love, and they bicycled around together at Riverbank, sitting on the side of the river having a picnic. It does seem terribly romantic and innocent. And they married there, and they, began a family.
You've got everybody from Freud, Mark Twain, Helen Keller even, getting obsessed with the idea that somebody else has written Shakespeare's plays. So the two different approaches are biographical and cryptographic. Well, the people at Riverbank Laboratories were the leading advocates of the cryptographic line of inquiry. So Elizabeth Wells Gallup, a Michigan school teacher, becomes highly successful as an advocate of a Baconian cipher running through the works of Shakespeare. Now, Francis Bacon was the first author in English to write an account of how ciphers work, and he produced a really powerful and subtle system, the Baconian biliteral cipher, it's called. It's the technical term for it. And basically, she became convinced that you could find the Baconian biliteral cipher running through Shakespeare's works, and that if you read them properly, they would reveal the secret message that Bacon was indeed the author of the plays. Well, that took considerable technical and technological and philological expertise, and so that's what Fabian is providing for her at Riverbank.
It makes Riverbank unique in that it becomes really the largest pool of people in the United States on the brink of World War I where they're studying cryptology. The Friedmans were at Riverbank when World War I broke out. And as this pool of people who knew something about codes and ciphers, and there weren't many people in the US military who knew about codes and ciphers, Fabian volunteered the laboratories as a training camp for officers who would be going into the Signal Corps and the Code and Cipher Service. They were both people who were going to be encoding and decoding things and people who were going to be breaking codes.
Friedman and his team created really a curriculum, a proper curriculum, printed with Riverbank stationery letterhead on it, exercise numbers, that sort of thing. And that grew straight out of the work that they had done in educating people on the Baconian controversy, on Bacon and Shakespeare.
Friedman very much wanted to enlist and to go overseas and to work with the Army itself. Fabian didn't want it to happen. According to Friedman's side of the story, and that's the only side we have, they had a nephew of Fabian who was in the Army, was an Army doctor, declare Friedman 4F so that he wouldn't be drafted. They claimed he had a heart problem. Later, as it turned out, he didn't. And he only found out about this and then later was able to discover that the Army had been requesting him to be sent, to be commissioned and be sent overseas. So eventually, he made direct contact with the Army. They took him in and commissioned him, and he went over to the headquarters, General of the American Expeditionary Forces in Europe, and became one of the chief cryptographers. But it took a long time. It took at least 1.5 to 2 years before that happened. It could have happened a lot sooner, and he felt that his contribution to the war could have been much greater had Fabian not blocked his way.
By 1921, Friedman had been hired by the Signal Corps as a contractor, essentially, and then he eventually becomes a government employee to build codes and ciphers for the U.S. military. In the 1920s, William is the sole cryptologist. He is essentially the NSA of the 1920s, aside from the Black Chamber, working for the military, mostly building codes and ciphers, investigating machinery for codes and ciphers, things that are proposed. I think it was Lambros Kalimahos who would eventually say of Friedman, he was like Midas, except that everything he touched turned to plain text. He just had a facility for this, and he gained a lot of expertise in this time in the 20s. It built up his rep with the military and built on his connections and made a real solid career. So I think that the 20s make him ready to take on the leadership of the SIS in 1930. He's put in charge of, it's a small group, it's probably no more than 12 or 15 people until 1937 or so, 38. And they're just investigating all sorts of different things. He was very focused on training. He spent a lot of time, his first hires in the 30s, he put them in the vault, which was really like a bank safe vault in the munitions building, to study the most secret of documents and codes and ciphers and really learn what they were doing before they started doing things. And there are a lot of interesting stories about what went on in the vault during the time and how they tried to figure out how do we go about building secure ciphers for the U.S. military. I think this was ticking along very nicely. There starts to be the idea of setting up radio intercept in the mid to late 30s as we start confronting the idea that we'll be at war with Japan at some point. And they start learning how to do, they're not actually doing that, but to take that intercept and break those codes and ciphers. It's a very different world than it would become in World War II. It's still a craft operation rather than an industrial scale operation, and they build up a lot of experience. Well, the book famously calls him the man who broke purple. The remarkable thing I find about Purple and the whole team effort is that the U.S. had no idea what the machine looked like. All we had was the intercept. and they built what they call the purple analog machine, where you type in the intercept on one end and it would print out the plain text Japanese ready for a linguist. This is very different. The only fragment of a purple machine the U.S. ever saw was found in the basement of the U.S. Embassy in Berlin, or the Japanese Embassy in Berlin, excuse me, at the end of World War II. And it looks so similar to the analog machine. It's amazing that these minds were just able to figure it out from just the intercept. As a mathematical, inspirational effort that I'm sure Friedman guided, and couldn't have happened without his guidance and training and inspiration.
And the scale of mental exertion involved in what he did and what his team did around the breaking of the Japanese code, where given a pattern of gibberish, you're able to reconstruct the machine that must have produced it. Just knowing the pattern, that's literally mind-blowing, and I think it did blow his mind.
In the months leading up to breaking the code, Friedman had a nervous breakdown, which gives you an idea of how hard he was working and how seriously he took his task. But he came back, and they worked on it, and they cracked the code. Later in his career, and in fact even closer to that event, people in the government accused William Friedman of discussing what he did with his wife, because she was a cryptographer also. And to the end, she said that the day they cracked Purple, he never said a word to her about it. He never mentioned it. He just came home like it was any other day, said, "What's for dinner, honey?" And they sat down and had a meal that she didn't know what he did. His relatives later asked him, nieces and nephews asked him, other cryptographers asked him, journalists asked him, TV interviewers asked him. He never said a word about it. He pointed to the 18 volumes of the Pearl Harbor report and said, "It's all in there."
After the war, there were some dismissals and downsizing, and then it was realized how we need to hire some of these people back, and it gets to be a bigger and bigger organization. The U.S. has 3 cryptologic organizations that don't work together very well, and a study is done, and they form the Armed Forces Security Agency in 1949. Another study is done, and it's decided that the Secretary of Defense has to be the executive agent, and that this is not an armed forces organization. This is the National Security Agency, and that happens in 1952.
William Friedman, of course, was older than most of these people. He had served in the first 2 wars. So he was the grand old gentleman. And the way NSA was going, the way the United States government was going, the way the world was going to be considerably different than William Friedman knew. He was used to hot wars, good wars, where you knew which side you were on, and you didn't do things like spy on your enemies. In the 50s and 60s, you're dealing with a Cold War. We spied on allies. He didn't like the idea that we would be spying on Britain. He had a hard time resolving the fact that you would give lie detector tests to people at NSA or the CIA. He lived in a world of gentlemen who trusted each other.
I think he sees himself falling by the wayside a little bit. It has turned into a bigger bureaucracy.
He really wrestled, I would say, particularly late in his life, with the ethics, something that is very much in the news right now. Friedman wrestled with the ethics of secrecy in a democracy. I think Friedman felt that there was a need for cryptography, there was a need for secret communication in governmental contexts. There was also a need for the kinds of other technologies and skills that come out of cryptographic work. I think he felt that quite profoundly, but I think he also felt that by the 1950s, he felt it had gone too far. And I think the response that he had in particular to the searching of his own library, to the kind of McCarthyite climate on Capitol Hill where he lived and worked by the early 50s, I think he was very uneasy with that.
His relationship to the organization, he was being moved out While they appreciate his expertise, his view on how the world or the NSA should be run probably didn't jive with the way it was going.
The combination of Shakespeare being the most famous author in history and possibly the most undocumented or absent figure in the archives, we just don't know that much about him or his life, has always opened up this question of who wrote these plays. You know, the little we know about this figure, William Shakespeare, doesn't really fit the kind of profile that you imagine is necessary, the kind of learning that's necessary, the life experience. You know, Shakespeare never, as far as we know, went very far from London or Stratford. So how would he know about Italy? How would he know about these historical sources that lie behind the plays that he writes? How would he be able to imagine these extraordinary, almost science fiction scenarios in things like The Tempest? You know, where did it come from? And that mystery opens up all kinds of speculation, all kinds of passionate inquiry, and mystery that people have to plunge into and try to crack in various ways. They simply were never persuaded as, let's say, literary scientists, that the methods people were using were persuasive. They simply felt that Elizabeth Wells Gallup and her successors were setting up rules for finding secret messages that were either flawed as methods or imperfect in their findings. And I think they ended up simply debunking attempt after attempt after attempt. And that led ultimately to this extraordinary hammer blow of a book, The Shakespearean Ciphers Examined, which was not their favorite title, and in fact it was not their title at all, by the way. They didn't like the fact that the book was called The Shakespearean Ciphers Examined, because they thought that that implied that there was a Shakespearean cipher to be examined.
Well, he wrote a book on it because there had been 30 years of correspondence with these people and many, many books written about it. And he came out with what I consider the definitive work, saying there is no cipher. These things are all subjective, and this should be the end of the story. Did this stop people from writing to him? No. William and Elizabeth Friedman decided to work on this book because they had been involved with the question for so long. And he was finally retired from the government, and so they could dedicate full time to these other little projects, none of which had anything to do with their government work. When William Friedman died, his wife decided to sell the collection, to find a place they could keep it intact. And that's very hard these days, because if you give it to a university library, they tend to break it up and put it in different places. They approached the Marshall Library. Forrest Pogue was willing to buy it and put it in a special room upstairs where the collection is there in its entirety, with a table at which William Friedman worked, his name plaque, and portraits of the Friedmans on the wall. And so somebody could walk in and basically feel that they were in the second floor library of William Friedman, as it was when he was collecting it.
I think this library gives us an enormous amount of material to help us think about the role of secrecy in a modern democracy. I think that's the way I would think about it, that it poses the life of William Friedman, and in fact his own struggles with the culture of secrecy that he helped to create, that he helped to found, give us new perspectives and new materials for thinking about whether it really makes sense. What do we need secrecy for? In what contexts? Where do we draw the line? Who's looking after, who's watching the watchmen?
And I know he really admired George Marshall and believed in him and thought this was the perfect place for his legacy. The American Black Chamber came about, sort of grew out of our experience in World War I. Herbert O. Yardley, who had been commissioned during the war and ran what was called MI8 in wartime, and then was a successful cryptologist in France during the peace treaty work at Versailles, came home, and he liked the work and he was interested. He had a lot of supporters in the military. The State Department funded this organization, which was known variously as MI8 and the Black Chamber.
America, after the war, some people realized that we need to be reading traffic, whether of enemies or sometimes even of allies, to find out what was happening overseas. Some other people disagreed with this and said that gentlemen shouldn't be reading each other's mails. Secretary Simpson coming up with that lovely quote. The Black Chamber had acted as this place where decoded diplomatic correspondence could be worked on.
Friedman was not working for Yardley in the Black Chamber. By 1921, Friedman had been hired by the Signal Corps as a contractor, essentially, and then he eventually becomes a government employee to build codes and ciphers for the U.S. military. So he's working in parallel in some sense, and it was a good concern. Everybody was happy, State Department was happy, and then the new Secretary of State, Henry Stimson, in 1929, and he does admit to having said something of this sort, the famous quote, "Gentlemen do not read other gentlemen's mail," and this is late 1929 at about the time the stock market is crashing. Whether this was a moral decision or an economic decision is still, unclear. We tend to go back and think, oh, it was a great moral outrage, but Stimson becomes the Secretary of War during World War II and is a huge supporter of communications intelligence, what grows the Black Chamber turns into. So either he had a moral change of heart in wartime, or it was a ruse, or some mixture of the two. But Yardley's concern is put out of business. And of course, this compels Yardley to find other ways to make money to support himself, his wife, his children, and his mistress. And he will go on then to make money by writing the book, The American Black Chamber, which details, sometimes fancifully and not necessarily accurately, how he got into the code making and code breaking business as a State Department clerk, what he did during the war. It slurs some of the work of the AEF in code making and code breaking during the war. And then he details some of the things the Black Chamber did. And of course, this made the book a very big bestseller in foreign parts, especially its Japanese translation sold very well. And you can imagine that the Japanese found out that their communications were being read. They moved on to make more difficult things. And, we can get into that. So Yardley is a pivotal figure in some ways, and very polarizing figure in the cryptologic community of the time, because the people at that time in 1929, 1930, there's a very, very small group of people who understand cryptology. It's not a big concern. It's not a big organization. And things sort of divide out as Yardley's book comes out, and people shun him, and people don't want to work with him, and people don't want to have anything to do with him.